What's up everybody, it's Izzy, and in this video what I want to talk about are the pros and cons of rounding your back when you deadlift. So the first thing that I want to address is that this video is going to be primarily viewed through the prism of competitive powerlifting. In my opinion, if you're a quote-unquote general strength trainee, which basically means, somebody who's just lifting to look good, to feel good, or you're lifting to get strong for another sport, I don't think you should accept any degree of rounding. And the reason why I say that is because any degree of rounding increases your risk of injury. There's no way around that. And sometimes people like to say, well, if you only round your upper back, you're not going to get hurt doing that. Well, in reality, you can herniate a thoracic disc just as much as you can herniate a lumbar disc. Even though it's less likely for this injury to happen, it can still happen. And the other part of that is that, in my experience, most people cannot keep their lower back truly flat while they round their upper back. More often than not, when you're rounding your upper back, you're going to be likely at maximal weights to round your lower back a little bit as well. Now, you might be super rounded in the upper back and only barely rounded in the lower back, but the bottom line is that any rounding of the back tends to lead to more rounding of the back, especially at heavier weights. I also think there's an argument to be made for a higher degree of transference to sport and everyday life and staying healthy by keeping your back flat. So there's that as well. But more importantly, I think, is the injury side of things. If you're not doing this from a competitive perspective, if you're not coming at it with a competitive goal set, I really don't see why you would accept the risk to your everyday quality of life that comes with doing round back deadlifts. Anyway, on to actual powerlifting. I think you have to make a distinction when it comes to whether or not you're going to be better and lift more weight with your back rounding based on a couple of things. And the first one that I'll talk about is sumo versus conventional. So it's very difficult to unround a super rounded over deadlift when you pull sumo, at least compared to conventional. And one of the big reasons for this is that your legs are outside of your hands and they're out at an angle. So when you pull conventional with your legs inside of your hands, you can rebend your knees, pushing your legs forward, and ramp the bar up your legs a little bit as you're unrounding. Now, technically this is illegal, but if it's minor, it is never called. Not even in the IPF, not even in the USAPL, not even in the CPU, it's not called. So there is a significant leverage advantage when you're trying to unround a conventional deadlift versus when you're trying to unround a sumo deadlift. You just can't rebend your knees and get them underneath the bar effectively the way that you can with a narrow stance. And this is very evident if you watch someone do power cleans, where this double knee bend, the second knee bend, is actually a critical part of the movement that leads to you being able to do the most weight possible on a power clean. Well, you can get a similar action on deadlift, obviously not to the same extent, where you get this legal ramping with a conventional deadlift. So in my experience, it's possible for conventional deadlifters to get away with a lot more rounding and being able to unround at the top versus, say, a sumo deadlifter who's going to be put in a very poor position to finish with a rounded back. However, and I think this next distinction is really what can make anybody of any style figure out whether or not rounding is going to be better for them, and that is, it really depends on what your individual strength curve is. So let me come at this from one premise that I think most of us will accept, and that is, rounding your back in the starting position improves your leverages in the starting position, but hurts your leverages at lockout. So really briefly, I've done entire videos and articles on this, but when you round your back, it allows you to start with a higher hip position and your hips closer to the bar, which automatically is going to improve your leverage. Your knee angle is also going to be more open with a rounded back because it effectively makes your arms a little bit longer in that starting position. And if your knees are more open and your hips are higher, that's going to improve your leverage. Imagine like a quarter squat versus a half squat. You're always going to be able to do more with a quarter squat. Well, rounding your back allows you to get closer to that quarter squat instead of doing a half squat off of the ground. So, if we operate from the premise that a flat back deadlift will have better leverages at lockout, but a rounded deadlift will have better leverages off of the floor, the way that you can tell what is going to work best for you has to do with your individual strength curve. And I already mentioned that, but that's the reasoning. So, if you are somebody who misses off of the floor, it's very likely that some degree of rounding is going to be beneficial for you. This is because, again, it doesn't matter if a flat back deadlift improves your leverages at lockout if you can't get the weight off of the floor. But you could get that weight off of the floor with the round back and still unround your back at the top. And that's the key distinction, is what is your strength curve and what position is most advantageous to address your weakest range of motion. So for people that are weakest around the knees, below, above, at any kind of a lockout position, hammering good starting position with as flat of a back as possible is usually going to be their best bet. It's usually how they're going to lift the most weight because it puts them in the best position in their weakest part of the range of motion. This is going to be the case for most sumo lifters, like the vast majority, and very few conventional deadlifters in my experience. So again, though, it can work both ways with either style. It's just that more often than not, with conventional, it's a lot easier to unround at the top, so you can get away with rounding and you can lift more when you round because you can break more weight from the floor. And again, I've already mentioned the problems doing that sumo. However, I will also say that I have seen people who use a sumo stance who lift more with a rounded back. And for these people, even a fully rounded back, and here's kind of how you can tell. If you still can't break the bar off of the floor with a rounded back, like that's how weak you are at the bottom of the lift, you're probably going to be your strongest with a rounded back because your ability to unround still exceeds your ability to break weight off of the floor. And that's kind of how you can make the correct decision for yourself personally, is if you start to round your back a little bit and then you have tremendous lockout problems, it may not be the best solution for you. But if you round your back and you're still the weakest part of the movement for you is right off of the floor or mid-shin or something like that, then accepting a little bit of rounding is going to be usually your best bet for lifting the most weight possible. And again, this is very individual and it's based on your strength curve. So, I have seen people with a toes to plate sumo stance who can get away with a very rounded back because they're so weak off of the floor relative to their ability to unround that it doesn't hinder their pull. However, I've also seen people who need a minimal degree of rounding at most, otherwise it really affects their ability to lock out the weight. And if this is you, you're going to want to drill more of a flat back position in your rep training and in your training in general. And to kind of bring this to a conclusion here, I will say that in my experience, most sumo lifters will not be able to get away with rounding, but there are a select rare few who are so weak off of the ground that they can get away with rounding because they can still unround at the top better than they can break weight from the floor. This tends to be the case more for semi-sumo pullers, but I have seen a very small amount of really wide stance sumo people who fit into this category as well. For conventional, I want to say it's universal, but it's not, because I can think of like Mike Teixeira and maybe like two other people that pull with a completely flat back on a conventional max. But more often than not, almost every conventional deadlifter that I've ever worked with is a little bit stronger when or sometimes really significantly stronger, accepting some degree of rounding. And like I said, one of the big reasons for this is it simply allows them to break more weight from the floor. And with a conventional deadlift, you're in a much better position to unround your back at the top. So it's much easier to get away with rounding. Whereas with sumo, that tends to not be the case. But anyway, I covered a lot of ground very quickly in this video. So if you have any questions about what I'm saying, feel free to ask. But again, a quick recap in my experience, and this is an overly simplified version because I'm giving it to you a 30-second soundbite here. Do not round your back at all if you're a general strength trainee or training for other sports, or you're really considerate about your health and longevity, or you just don't like mean comments about your form on social media. And rounding is going to be, and for competitive powerlifting, is going to be determined by your strength curve. So if you're very weak off of the floor relative to lockout, you'll tend to be able to get away with more rounding because your pull is limited by your off the ground strength and not your unrounding strength. And again, I'll further subdivide this into saying that most sumo deadlifters, the vast majority, should be trying to pull with a flat back, whereas the vast majority of conventional deadlifters will be better off with some degree of rounding. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed the video. As always, my friends, have a nice day and good luck through training. Peace.